All right, good morning, everyone. To start off with a story real quick. So I got to my Airbnb last night, and I mentioned that I was going to a Cartographic conference, and my host says, oh, I have this 1933 nautical map. And I was like, yes, like Cartographic gal, excellent, getting off to a good start. And then she's like, oh, like, tell me more about this Cartographic conference. I'm really interested in it as I'm looking at this 1933 nautical map that she happened to find at a garage sale. And I was like, well, I'm presenting tomorrow. And she's like, oh, like, what are you presenting on? I was like, mapping Silicon Prairie. And I started going into my presentation, and her eyes just started glazing over. And I was like, oh, no, huge mistake. So I tried to salvage. I'm like, well, there's other, like, great presentations and, like, cartographic elements happening. She's like, well, good night. And I was like, oh, no. So if any of your eyes glaze over, feel free to leave. I'm not offended. But I'm very interested in this topic. My name is Marc Marean. I'm from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And this is my thesis topic, so it is a little research heavy. I will give a forewarning. However, I'm really excited about the maps to show you today. So the origins come from the Silicon Valley. In 1955, Stanford University hosted an incubator, basically a collective of ideas in order to help Hewlett-Packard, HP Computers, create the microprocessor. Silicon Valley was an agricultural region. It had the resources available, tech-wise, to start with the like a tech industry. However, it was underutilized. But with that stage in 1955, Silicon Prairie or Silicon Valley erupted, and other geographers, economists wanted to find out how can we replicate the Silicon Valley. With that, other landscapes started to emerge and get this moniker of Silicon before the name. So the Silicon Forest in Portland, Oregon, where a huge conglomeration of tech companies are there. You have the Silicon Wadi in Tel Aviv, Israel. A lot of tech companies moving there. And then this phenomena of the Silicon Prairie, which is my research topic. First instance was in 1979. D Magazine in Dallas-Fort Worth explained this idea of a tech startup happening in Dallas-Fort Worth because of tech industries, the amount of people who knew how to work on hardware, et cetera, for computer processing. So in essence, what is this region really experiencing? A lot of revitalization right now. So in the Great Plains area, the Midwest, a lot of people are moving back, and a lot of people are trying to make a mark on the landscape. So in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for example, the rail yard development. In Lincoln, Nebraska, where I'm from and I go to school, the Haymarket District. In this previous photo, we see the warehouse, the old train station. In the background, we see this looming tech company called Huddle, which is a sports recording software that started in Lincoln, Nebraska from some computer science majors. Joel Kotkin, who's a famous urban geographer, says that the Great Plains area is in the midst of historic recovery right now because of this. A lot of tech companies are moving in from the coasts, and a lot's changing. Old fabrics of life that people are used to in the Great Plains are changing drastically. And because of that, the expansion of new resources. So the creation of fiber optic networks. I believe North Dakota has 48% coverage of fiber optics. And Kansas City, with Google Fiber being one of the test cities. Information sharing, the capability to handle a large amount of data is making the Great Plains region a very, very interesting place to settle. Richard Florida calls this movement of people to the Great Plains the creative class, people who no longer use their hands for a skill to make money, but to use their minds into creative solutions. So what are some factors that people typically associate with the Silicon Prairie? If I approach the Silicon Prairie to anyone on the street and they've heard of it, typically they associate it with startup culture, which is true. Lincoln, Nebraska, CBS News in 2016 had an excellent article. They interviewed some people who moved from the coast to Lincoln. Why did you move? And they stated things like accommodating community. People want you to succeed in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in Des Moines, and in Minneapolis. Workforce that supplies multinodal systems, so information sharing. People want to share information. People want to help each other. And lastly, difference in cost of living, which is the big one. So if you look at the chart, this is from Zillow. I love Zillow. I search it all the time. But if we look at this is the chart displays in June of 2019 the median sale price of a home. So on average, United States, $234,000. If you look at Des Moines, which is in the Silicon Prairie, we have $136,000. Pretty good. Tacoma, where we're at now, about 3.2. And Boston, $644,000. So you see that the Midwest and Great Plains area is affordable. People want to move here. It's low startup costs. If you're using like a software or some sort of information technology, you typically don't need to ship anything. It keeps costs low. However, so the Silicon Valley was associated with a valley, Silicon Forest with a forest. However, you would think with the Silicon Prairie, it's the prairie. However, major news outlets really don't even know where the Silicon Prairie is. They're asking questions and they're heading, which isn't a great sign. Is Omaha becoming the hub? What is the Silicon Prairie? Midwest Silicon Prairie is Kansas City. That's the heart of the Silicon Prairie. Nebraska is the heart of Silicon Prairie. So there's a little bit of confusion and a little bit of diffusion about what actually is this region. So my research and cartographic questions, hopefully we can get to today, is this region bound by a geological layer of some sort, the prairie? Is this actually in the prairie, or is this just synonymous with the Midwest, or is it synonymous with any other regions? And then lastly, what cartographic methods could I use, or could we all use, to help determine a region that's a little bit ambiguous? So my research methods is a nonprofit organization based out of Omaha called the Silicon Prairie News. They create this report called the State of the Silicon Prairie, and they list off like 52 cities of what they create from an index about cities with great venture capital or cities with, quote, cool jobs. All of these go into this database and they rank them based on this listing. I pulled some ecological data from the US FS, and then using ArcGIS and miscellaneous extensions. So if we look at this map, we see all the cities that was chosen by the Silicon Prairie News. So we see anywhere from Rapid City in South Dakota to many cities in Wisconsin, Eau Claire and La Crosse. We see larger cities like Chicago, Milwaukee. We also see some smaller like college towns, Wichita and Tulsa. If we use a kernel density, and we're just using spatial proxy, so we're not looking at cities based on population, we're not looking at cities, and we're not weighting them any differently. We're just looking at like high-tech clusters. Where is information sharing potentially happening? We see a lot of different clusters throughout the map. Topeka, Kansas City area, we see Des Moines and Ames, Iowa City. We see Chicago, Minneapolis, Madison. And then we see Peoria, Bloomington, Springfield being another cluster, smaller area up in North Dakota by Fargo, and then we see Oklahoma City as well also. So with this, there's two approaches I could have used. You could use choropleth or you could use daisy-metric. Choropleth I thought was a little bit ambiguous, not in the sense of I wanted to, because this region is undefined, I think it would be hazardous to use an already defined administrative boundary in order to classify this information. So for example, if I were to use a choropleth map and display this information, it would show South Dakota and all of South Dakota with 3 cities instead of just regions. Daisy-metric, which I like, it's creating zones. It's creating newly created zones of uniform statistical value based on weight, as defined by McCleary in 1969. Using color ramp as a means of density, of course, a darker color representing more of a weight, lighter color being more of a reach, as I'd like to think of it. And of course, this is working with spatial proxy as well. When we throw in the prairie grass, something really interesting shows up. We see that the almost western frontier of the tall grass prairie is predominantly what people mentally consider as the Silicon Prairie. We see very, very few spots actually in the mixed grass region up by South Dakota in the Rapid City example. And then we see a lot of the Silicon Prairie in regions outside of the prairie grass, outside of tall grass. And so throwing in our last boundary of temperate broadleaf and mixed forest, we see that the rest of the Silicon Prairie actually extends into this brand new ecoregion that isn't even considered a prairie, which is super, super interesting. So looking at the cartographic design of this, of course, we zoom out, we look at the different ecoregions that are involved. In the color scheme, I wanted to match tall grass with traditionally what we view as tall grass, a darker kind of burnt orange, mixed grass being a little bit muddier, a brown, and then a short grass being more yellow like a stubble, for example. And then using the temperate broadleaf and mixed as another example, another control group, we're just going to classify that all as green since it's outside of the prairie region. As a researcher and a carto noob, sometimes you can get so caught up with your findings, how interesting it might be. If you take anything from this presentation, know that maps still need to be legible and they still need to be neat. they still need to display things properly. So looking at annotated labeling, the labeling in here is a little bit clustered, and of course that needs to be fixed up in order to make this an appropriate display of information. So lastly, going from significant data findings, we're looking at the tall grass prairie in this western frontier. We're looking at just on the western side, we see a lot of information, a lot of densities right along that tall grass prairie. And so looking at these tables, essentially the percentage of coverage of the Silicon Prairie in per grass type, we see tall grass. 53% of the Silicon Prairie is in tall grass. Only 1.4% of Silicon Prairie is in mixed grass. We actually don't have anything in the short grass area. If we look at temperate broadleaf in mixed forest ecoregions, we see the Great Lakes has 6.7 about, the Ozarks with 31%, basically the St. Louis area. What's really interesting about this is the prairie forest border, which Soja and Shinar in 1999 kind of describes as the borderlands theory, the third space. Essentially, where areas of drastic differences in ecology, you have greater diversity, a greater influence to share ideas, etc. And with it being prairie and half forest, it would be interesting to look at the idea, is Wisconsin actually the Silicon Prairie? Is that the actual heart because of this influence and this shift? So in conclusion, geospatial and cartographic principles, of course, can help us understand and define these areas that are steeped in ambiguity. And it's also important to state the mental versus the cartographic methods of classifying an area. It'd be really easy to look at our map from before and to say, this is environmentally deterministic. So Silicon Prairie can only happen in tall grass prairie because there's a sudden endpoint about right on that western frontier. And of course, this is also mental. I highly doubt people are going out into the Great Plains and Midwest and saying, oh, tall grass is here, this must be where the Silicon Prairie and like tech startups are happening. So you have to be a little bit careful in how you display information. And I think this is a great step to kind of alleviating public perception of the area. And lastly, cartographic methods imposed can help us create new avenues of mixed method research. So we could look at potentially correlations between housing prices and tall grass prairie, or public perception and technology in the prairie forest border. Any of these things would be very applicable for future research. And that's all I have today. Are there any questions?